Welcome to Soundtrack Your Life, a podcast about soundtracks, music, and movies. Each episode features a guest and focuses on a specific soundtrack and the personal stories connected to it. Now here's your host, Ryan Pack.
Welcome to Soundtrack Your Life, the podcast where we talk about soundtracks and our personal connections to them. Today we are going to talk about the 1984 Albert Magnoli film Purple Rain. Today my guest is a good friend of mine. He is also the person who officiated my wedding. Welcome to the podcast, Reverend Kevin Doi.
Hey Ryan, thanks for having me. It's always a great time when we're talking about Prince.
I know. You are the biggest Prince fan I know, so I thought you would be appropriate for the podcast. Kevin, why are we talking about Purple Rain today?
Well, it's obviously the iconic album from Prince. I think artistically, he had some wonderful albums I'm really familiar with that I think shaped kind of the soundtrack of my growing up. And I was as surprised as maybe anyone that Purple Rain, kind of took off, because before that, his albums didn't sell really that well. And he was often ridiculed in a lot of demographics. He was very popular on black radio at the time. But he was a bit of an enigma. People couldn't figure him out. He, had this kind of androgynous, look to him. And so I think people didn't know where to fit him. And he certainly wasn't great for radio per se. And yet this album just really took off. I think it was probably, at least at the time, maybe in his catalog, the most kind of pop out of his records. And it just launched him into a different stratosphere. And Prince was a household name after that.
So in 1984, there's no internet, there's no IMDb. So how did you find out about Purple Rain, and what did you think of, and as a fan, what did you think of Prince trying to transition into doing film?
I think I was skeptical, actually. Again, as you mentioned, it's like pre-internet, really pre-MTV, all of that. So all we had was the radio and record stores. And in Los Angeles, 1580 K-Day and KJLH were the two prominent black stations. And those are the stations I would listen to as an Asian American who just really loved R&B and soul music. That was kind of what our group of friends listened to. And so I remember as a freshman in high school, which is like 1978, on the radio, this song called Soft and Wet. And it was the first time I ever heard of Prince and was exposed to his music. And I remember he was really big in our little house parties. And I have a 45 still of that record. And, from there, he went on to make, I Want to Be Your Lover on his second album, which I have in vinyl when it came out. And then he had this, highly sexualized third album. And then Controversy was his fourth album, which I love. That's still to this day probably my favorite Prince album. But as you can imagine, it was again, it didn't sell that well. He was pretty controversial. The closest thing in those days that I could equate him to was he seemed to be kind of in the same line as a Marvin Gaye, who talked and made this uneasy connection between spirituality and sexuality. And so, that's the Prince I knew. And so for him to come out with a movie, I was very skeptical about what it could be. And, he's not an actor. So I just thought, oh man, this is not going to go very well. But I was curious, and I think I found out about the movie, like any movie in those days. You opened up the LA Times in the calendar section and you looked at the ads. There was pages and pages of movie ads, and you would look at the little boxes to find out where it was playing. And I remember going with my friends to go see Prince, and yeah, it was just the record had come out already and was very popular, both kind of in the car radio type of listening, but also at all the dance parties and hotel parties we used to go to back in the day in college. And I thought the movie, what was so wonderful about the movie was that because there was no internet and Prince is already a private person, there was really no way to know him, like know anything about his background. All I knew was, he played all the instruments, did all the vocals. Like he was this like incredible prodigy. And so the fact that it was semi-autobiographical, I'm not sure how much of it totally lined up with his life, but the fact that it kind of told his story in this really interesting way, and then to have the music as a soundtrack, and also to have those really powerful live performances as part of the movie was, just really wonderful.
So going into the movie, I know you were kind of skeptical, but from what you saw in the ad in the LA Times, did it kind of match your expectations of what you ended up seeing?
Yeah, I can't remember what I was expecting. I think I had no idea what the movie was about, quite frankly. I don't even remember if there was a tagline attached to the movie, but, Doves Cry was out as a single. I think Let's Go Crazy might have been out. The album was just taking off and was fantastic. And so I think that's really what drew people to the film, as far as I can remember and recall. And our worlds were real small back in those days. It was really hard to tell how popular it was, but I know my friends, we loved it. We saw it multiple times. And in subsequent years, it was like one of those movies that we never got tired of watching. And I think it's held up well over these years too, amazingly. Some of these kind of concert footage films or films with non-actor musicians in them don't always age well, but this seemed to age well, as well as his music.
The movie was made for $7 million and ended up making 10 times its budget. So obviously a success financially. And it's kind of amazing that, there are really no-name actors. I believe the actors that play his parents had been in previous films, but,
I think Clarence Williams was like part of the Mod Squad. He was in he was his father in the film.
Right. But
yeah.
No A-list actors are in this movie.
Yeah.
And
Apolonia played herself, basically.
Yeah, everyone's playing themselves, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Prince is playing, quote, the kid, but, Morris Day is the bad guy.
Right.
And he's walking around with Jerome. Like, these are all people basically in Prince's orbit.
That's right. At least in my circles, like, the time was, like, they were equally as stellar as Prince. Because we were going to dance parties, and in some ways their music was easier to dance to, and so I think we were we enjoyed the film not only for Prince, but seeing the time there. And then back in those days, we didn't know Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis were going to be what they become. And then Apolonia, obviously, but Vanity 6 was really popular as well. So there was this whole Prince world that was on film that that at least those of us who love Prince, we were kind of led into his world a bit, and I think that was part of the fascination.
Yeah, like most of the film is shot in Minneapolis.
Yeah,
the Revolution, while not called the Revolution in the film, they're in the movie. Wendy and Lisa obviously play an integral part in the film. I would assume all the extras at First Avenue are not white pasty Hollywood extras, that they're just white pasty Minnesotans who wanted to be in the Prince movie.
Right. Yeah, and the fact it was filmed, basically on location in his hometown, and all the haunts he would, play at, I think, it's early in the movie. I think it's "Take Me With You," where he's on his bike with Apolonia on the back, and they're driving through the countryside. I mean, with that with that particular song, it's just like it's really magical. And if someone from LA, I have no idea what Minnesota's like, and so again, it's just kind of opened up his life for us on the big screen. Yeah, and so it was just it was like one of those films where it wasn't just about a film that stars Prince, but it was like um, letting us a bit into his life, and all the intrigue about like how much is of what's portrayed on film is true, and all of that. So I think it made it. It kind of drew you in that way.
Yeah, and clearly shooting the film in Minnesota and having him play with basically his band and having Morris Day and the time in the movie, he's asking you to read into it as basically an autobiographical movie.
Right, right. I'm curious to know, because you grew up in and around Minneapolis, and I know that you're younger than I am, but just what your recollections of Prince and what it meant for your hometown and for you personally. Um, you know, Minnesota was always to me just some kind of Midwestern town that not that's a state. Minneapolis is a Midwestern town, um, and so there was always kind of this mystery that um, this musical genius would come out of there and never really moved to LA. And so, um, what's your recollections?
So I was born in the 80s, so I kind of wasn't very, I guess I wasn't very, I don't know, cognizant of exactly what was going on. I remember, Prince was always on the radio, and part of that was because he was, cranking out the hits. This is kind of the peak of his hit making career. After I moved to California and when I really started getting into music and I started, exploring, whether it be Prince or like the Replacements, I started realizing that I knew a lot more of their catalog than I realized because I think it was just constantly on the radio. Looking back, I really realized that, Prince had this galvanizing effect on the city and its music scene. So Purple Rain, all the musical performances take place at a club called First Avenue, um, which is still in Minneapolis. It's still this beloved rock club. And I remember like on social media, I saw someone post like a concert calendar of First Avenue in like 1984, 1985. And, it's got Prince and the Replacements are playing and Husker Du's playing all in like a 2 week span. Wow. And just to think of how exciting that had to have been to be a music lover in,
Wow.
Minneapolis at the time. Like you had all this stuff going on. And obviously Prince's success or Prince's genius is, kind of getting other people to start bands. It's kind of like the Seattle scene, right? Everyone is trying to find the next Nirvana. When Prince is exploding nationally, people are looking for maybe not the next Prince, but Minneapolis kind of became this hub for music in the 80s.
Amazing. Now, when you watched the film, were you able to identify the different locations in the film and the geographical locations? And
I mean, most of the film takes place in Minneapolis, and that definitely looks like Minneapolis to me. I'm quite aware of what downtown Minneapolis looks like, and there's 10,000 lakes in Minneapolis. There's 10,000 lakes in Minnesota, so I can't be like, oh yeah, I know that lake.
I never really read anywhere, but I wonder if Prince had, it could just simply be that to make it authentic, he wanted it there to be filmed there, but also if he's somehow paying some homage to the city. I kind of always wondered that. because it's just shot so wonderfully. You know.
Yeah, I assume he wanted some sort of authenticity, knowing that it's gonna, people are gonna read into it about it being about his life,
Yeah.
regardless.
Yeah.
But I think, just with everyone that he wanted in the movie already being in Minnesota, it's just easier to film it in Minnesota than flying everyone out to LA.
Sure.
With Morris Day and Jerome and the Revolution, like they're already there. And I don't, he doesn't have songs about Minnesota specifically that I'm familiar with, but I think he had a real love for being from there. Ended up he ended up building Paisley Park in Minnesota. That's where he lived till he pretty much passed.
Hmm.
I'm sure he had houses elsewhere, but Minnesota was home base to him.
Yeah.
I actually got to go to Paisley Park a couple years ago, so it's turned into a museum, and they've done a good job with it. I don't know if they're making enough money to keep it open long term, but that was a pretty cool experience.
Oh, must be amazing.
Yeah, we got to go into a lot of rooms. Apparently, there are like rooms that are like there's different tiers of the tour, but um, they made his basketball court room into what they call the Purple Rain room, so they had the motorcycle from the film and a couple other some memorabilia and stuff in there. I believe that is the room that Dave Chappelle or Charlie Murphy is referencing in that Chappelle Show sketch where they end up playing basketball and he offers them pancakes at the end. But yeah, it was a cool tour. So we learned about Purple Rain, and then we learned that he directed Under the Cherry Moon, and then he wrote and directed Graffiti Bridge. As far as the Prince the Prince trilogy goes.
Yeah.
Not that we need to talk about whether those movies are good. Most people will probably say no, but that's not the point.
To move the conversation back, I recall that Purple Rain served in kind of the same way that the Motown 25 program, when it debuted on live television, where like the world saw the Jacksons and Michael Jackson, like almost for the first time. It was so weird. Like, again, I've been following the Jacksons since, they were, young men. And, with the cartoons and, I have all like the old Jackson 5 stuff, and I saw them through their CBS years, and they were on CBS Channel 2 here in Los Angeles. They had their own show. And it was like the world got to see how amazing, this, these brothers were, particularly Michael. And I felt like Purple Rain was kind of the same experience for me. Like I had, loved Prince, I loved his music. And then it just seemed like he was opened up to the world in a way like never before. And, it was like, it was bittersweet because, like, it's like when you have when you find a new artist that you really dig and they're not popular yet, there's something really cool about that. And then they get popular and you're really happy for them, but then, they become popular. So I think I felt that with Prince a bit. He'll never be this underground artist anymore. Not that he was totally underground, but again, I think 1999 was out before this album, and Little Corvette was out, and he was making some inroads on MTV at the time. But so that's I think my experience of the film and this album, and his skyrocketing into fame.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel like the film humanizes him in a way without humanizing him too much. Like, he's still Prince and he's still this amazing musician, but it made him accessible enough. Because even, you just brought up 1999, like the song 1999 itself, like as popular as it was, it's like a song about like the end of times.
Yeah. Yeah.
So even though Purple Rain has songs like Computer Blue and like Darling Nikki, it has some of his like most straightforward, accessible music. I mean, obviously the beginning of Let's Go Crazy is a little out there, but like Take Me With You and even I Will Die For You, I feel like are some of the most like straightforward pop songs that he had written at this point.
Yeah. Very much so. And yet, like, I've listened to the album again recently. It's like the music it holds up. It still sounds experimental. And that's really hard. Um, Even I know we both listen to the Beatles and the Beach Boys, and it's really hard to ever put ourselves back to how like Pet Sounds or Sergeant Pepper's or Rubber Soul must have sounded to people when it first came out. Like, it's just hard to imagine the shock to hear the kinds of sounds and arrangements on those albums. And that's how I felt about Prince. Like there was no one like Prince. The arrangements, this weird mixture of rock and soul and sexuality and that you could dance to, and spirituality and politics. I mean, it was all wrapped up in there, and he could easily kind of move from one genre to the next, and always experimenting. And so I see this as his most pop offering. But even as I listened to it more recently, it's like, wow, there are moments where he nevertheless keeps it pretty experimental and kind of a little risque, like Darling Nikki, as you mentioned, which I think, if I recall at the time, was cause for some of the labeling on albums after that.
Yeah, Darling Nikki upset Tipper Gore so much that they started labeling albums with parental advisories that there's explicit content.
So there you go. Yeah, and there's this way in which the opening, like, it's got to be one of the classic openings ever for an album, right? Is the Let's Go Crazy opening with the it's almost like coming to church, right? You're going to church with Prince, and it's just like, it's still prophetic in some ways to today. I was just thinking about just the crazy times we live in, and punch a higher floor. So I think it's that, and he kind of basically ends the film. I know there's Baby I'm a Star at the very end, but I Would Die For You again. It's like this messianic imagery, and it's almost like it's a bookend. Like, you basically went to church with Prince, which is kind of this weird thing. But I think, for me personally, as someone who I'm a minister now, but this kind of spiritual aspect to his lyrics is very mysterious, and yet, like, is he, like, what's he saying? The way that I felt about Earth, Wind, and Fire and other people who, I think were very spiritual. So I did appreciate that about his music. I did. The fact that he, I can't recall, but to have an album like that, to have a film with that kind of risk taking. It wasn't so much that he totally sold out. He didn't sell out at all, in my opinion, to make the film or to make the music. He was still true to himself, and yet, yeah, you're right. I think it was more accessible for the masses.
Yeah, like he knew that this could be his moment, and he cashed in as much as he could have. Like, he rose to the occasion of the moment, I guess is the better way to say it, because I don't, he didn't sell out. Like, this is a very singular vision, I feel like, Like, I thought about introducing the film at the beginning of the podcast as just, the Prince starring film, because that's really what matters in Purple Rain. It doesn't matter who directed it or who wrote it. It really just, like, he's such a force in the movie, and obviously the soundtrack matches that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'm not sure conceptually how it all came together, but the fact that he ended up really using the music to tell the story as much as the acting. Which I'm sure, like, a lot of the soundtracks that you feature in movies that have this strong, memorable soundtrack. It's the soundtrack is as much a star as as the actors themselves. I feel like that's very true of this film. Obviously much of it's concert scenes, but and the music certainly adds and tells the story as much as what's going on screen.
Oh, absolutely. And I think I've read stories that he was writing songs while they were making the movie. I think the director told him he was looking for a specific song and mood, and then that's when Prince wrote "When Doves Cry."
Mm.
Like, he was basically told, like, "Hey, I need something that feels like this," and Prince wrote it in a day.
Yeah, amazing. I think too, looking back, I think the movie has held up because there is a singular vision to the movie. Like, if you just take the album by itself without like tying it to the film, the range of the kinds of songs that are on the album it's quite amazing. Like, there's no two songs that sound the same. Sometimes with soundtracks you get certain themes throughout, and so there's kind of a thread for the soundtrack, but you don't see that here like many soundtracks to films, and yet so there's a way in which the film serves to hold the music together as well, just as much as the music serves the
I
film.
mean, so in the movie, there's some pretty amazing live performances, and in a way, like, I'm not sure how the director was able to capture that energy. Like, it's pretty, those performances are so iconic. Luckily, you and I were able to see him in person, even
Yes.
though. So we saw him. I don't know how long ago. It was maybe like 7 or 8 years ago.
Yeah, that's probably around there. Yeah.
We probably saw maybe 30 years after Purple Rain, but he still knew how to bring it. He was still amazing live.
Yeah, I was I think I was telling you all night, like, I was like so happy that he was he was in form, man. He sounded good, he looked good. I mean, he- you know, artists sometimes age, and you could tell their voice isn't quite the same, or whatever. They don't look like they used to. But man, he was Prince, and I think we were really, really lucky to see him. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, he was not playing like he was a legacy act at all.
No.
He like the energy he brought. He was dancing and playing the guitar. He hit all the high notes. Like, he was still the ultimate showman.
Yeah, and he wasn't just like going to the well and just playing all his hits. I mean, he certainly played a lot of his hits, but it wasn't like it wasn't a final tour kind of tribute show. It was he played new stuff and old stuff, and I think in some ways I don't know how much of the crowd just wanted to hear the hits, but the fact that he was still an artist, that was still making music. And yeah, it was just, again, kind of like the movie. I wasn't quite sure what to expect, because he was a little bit up in age, but man, I was like, I couldn't have been happier.
And might I add, we saw Prince in a pretty small venue.
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
he wasn't just like a dot, while we were in the nosebleeds. Like it was a standing room only show. And you kind of saw, and you could kind of tell that he reveled in that. Like he liked playing in the smaller room.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It felt like those surprise shows that he might show up at. Except we knew this was he was going to be there, but it felt kind of like that.
Like I vividly remember him like playing guitar and then like leaning back and having like the crowd kind of push him back on stage. Like it was kind of like a mini like crowd surf while he was still doing like 10 things at once. And it was just so amazing to see that in person.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was introducing his new band at the time. I think it was like called Third Eye Girl or
Yeah, that's
something
right.
like
That's
that.
right. Yeah, that's right.
And I don't think he gets enough credit as a collaborator. He basically found these girls. I mean, they're all accomplished musicians, obviously, but he put this band together, and obviously, this is their highest profile gig. It would be anyone's highest profile gig to play with Prince, but he's. I know, obviously, he's had the Revolution and he's had New Power Generation, but he's always been known to be a collaborator. He's always been known to take other people's ideas into account, and he wrote for a lot of people. And I think the Vault, the infamous Prince Vault, has released some of those compositions that he made for other people, which
Yeah,
is really interesting.
yeah, yeah. I think I've read that, like with Wendy and Lisa, with Revolution, how he really he didn't control the process with them. Like they were, he treated them as equals. They contributed to music and lyrics. I think he wrote mostly everything, but in terms of the music, and he just incorporated. Yeah, it was totally collaborative, which is different in the film, right? I think one of the um, there are two characters in the film, Wendy and Lisa, and the rest of the band. I think they have a gripe with Prince, or the kid, right? Because he he's not a collaborator, if I recall correctly. But I think in real life that, as you mentioned, he was a collaborator. And I mean, I knew that I knew like the time, and Vanity Six, and Apolonia didn't really. She might have had like one hit, kind of, but um, it had some of the similar sound. And but again, there's hardly nothing to read in those days. There wasn't the internet, and so you weren't quite sure who was writing all this music and who was producing it, even. And I think Prince actually wrote a lot of that stuff, if I'm not mistaken. And so his generosity too. I mean, of course, we know about the Bangles, but um, yeah, just the generosity of um, you know, songs are like babies, right? To artists, you would know this better than I do. For him to be so generous with his work.
Yeah, absolutely. And asking for very little in return. Like I know he's written for Madonna, and obviously he wrote for the time. um, there's a bunch of there's a whole album of songs he wrote for other people, but I think all he really asked is like, if I call you out to Paisley Park, you better show up.
Yeah, Sheena Easton's in there somewhere, if I recall right, or yeah.
Yeah, like Manic Monday is obviously the big one that everyone points to, like, oh man, Prince wrote that. But he liked to write for other people. He he wrote so much music. I guess he realized that he couldn't hoard it all for himself, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
So obviously Prince is gone. His legacy. That's a weird way, but so let's talk a little bit about his legacy. I think the closest to Purple Rain that has come out since is Eminem's 8 Mile, where it's kind of similar. He's playing a character that very much seems like it's based on him.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a much more Hollywood sort of affair. Brittany Murphy's in it. That Brittany Murphy is a much bigger name than anyone that was in Purple Rain. I remember reading something from Questlove. I think some reporter asked him. I don't know if it was like shortly after the movie premiered. So shortly after 8 Mile premiered, someone asked Questlove what he thought of the movie, and Questlove's response was, "I liked it better the first time when it was called Purple Rain."
Right on.
And then I think the Roots ended up backing Eminem at the Oscars when he performed "Lose Yourself." So clearly, it didn't bother Eminem that much.
Probably made him respect him even more. That's awesome.
Yeah, but it's definitely one of those lightning in a bottle sort of things. Like you can never make another Purple Rain where the artist had that much control. Like he basically made that film outside the Hollywood system.
Yeah, I think the director was, first time director. Yeah, as you mentioned, probably not a huge budget actually for a film. Yeah.
Yeah, and then obviously to basically cast all his friends in the movie. Like if they tried to make Purple Rain like in 2020, they would even the Revolution would all be actors.
Right. Right. I think it's something to be said too. I was just thinking about how, his career in some ways paralleled Michael's career. They were a bit of rivals, and there's a way in which you look at Thriller, and you could look at Thriller in the same way that you look at Purple Rain, but there's clearly like Michael fell off the cliff after Thriller. Like his stuff just was never the same, wasn't ever as good, and you could see that line. And with Prince, as big as Purple Rain was, it's like, at some level, his two other films, just paled in comparison. But if people even remember them at all, but his music, like in some ways, I think he had a wider audience, and people began to really respect him as an artist in ways that he never had that kind of adulation prior to Purple Rain. Before we were talking outside this podcast, you were mentioning the Rolling Stones concert that he headlined for, where I think he was in a trench coat and his bikini bottoms and, got booed off the stage. So that was really Prince, that's what I remember of him. And the fact that his music endured after that, obviously he had many, many, many great albums. But that he was still making music all the way up to the end. That was interesting and, experimental. I think says a lot about him as an artist.
Yeah, on the Paisley Park tour, they played us a snippet of a song that he was working on, and he was working on a jazz album for Blue Note.
Really, I didn't know that.
Oh, that's what he was working on before he passed. Our mutual love of Prince is also why we ended up watching probably the most famous Prince cover band, Princess.
Yeah.
And that is a Prince cover band that is fronted by Maya Rudolph.
Yes.
Who's actually a great singer herself.
Yes.
She's Minnie Riperton's daughter.
Yes. Yes, who I also listened to when I was younger. Um, yeah, that was fun. That was fun, and I have you to thank because I didn't know Maya Rudolph fronted this cover band for Prince, um, and didn't know she was a big fan, and yeah, I don't remember too much of the show. I mean, I could visualize it. I just remember it was a lot of fun. It was fun to see. Um, she had fun with it, but in a way that was like, she because she loves the music, she loves Prince, and it was fun. It was like also a way for Prince fans to revel in the music, um, in a way that was like really celebratory, and yeah, it was just really cool.
Yeah, I think I remember during Purple Rain, she would like finger wags while singing some of the lyrics, and she would make facial expressions, because he's doing a little bit of sing talking in that song, during the verses, so she got like really into it, and you can tell like it's out of love, like it's for like she knows the song that well that she can add those little flourishes.
Yeah, yeah,
But I
yeah.
remember
She,
like laughing and loving it at the same time.
yeah, her and her partner up there were, yeah, were just really fantastic musicians. And it's just a great show. So much fun.
Yeah, we were laughing with Prince, not at
That's
Prince.
right. That's right. That's right. I know for your listeners, I'm a pastor now, and um, I've been in ministry for over 30 years, and I didn't grow up in the church. And when I came to faith, this is like uh, 1982, I think is when um, when I came to faith, and and one of my first questions that I said was, do I have to give up my Prince albums to follow Jesus, basically? And I'm so glad that I didn't. Um, and yeah, so I still have my old records, and um, yeah, and the older I get, the you know, I just read today that it's somehow like when you're a child, like you like you're looking at life as life is happening, and then as you get older and older and older, it's mostly memory. And like you, I think so much of my life is shaped by music. I can pinpoint songs and moments, important moments with like music, and music has a way of always taking me back to those moments. And um, yeah, Prince has always been one of those artists that um, can always go back to. And yeah, the fact that his music has held up so well, and amazingly, like 30 years later, still sounds fresh and experimental. It's really a credit to him. So yeah, the fact that I got, so part of my memory is being able to see Prince with you, and that's definitely one of the highlights of my life. And I'm not sure why I never saw him before. It's kind of like Stevie Wonder. I still haven't seen Stevie Wonder. We got to go see Stevie Wonder, man. um,
Okay, I'm down. I'm down.
like he's one of those artists that, gosh, I don't know why I haven't seen him.
Thank you, Kevin, for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun. Um, yeah, I miss talking music with you, and usually I have no idea about whatever artist you're talking about, but I'm glad I can contribute a little bit to the conversation today.
It was great swapping Prince stories with you.
Yeah, a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
So, um, Well, Kevin has nothing to plug, but once again, thank you for coming on. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can subscribe to it, write a review. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for joining us this week on Soundtrack Your Life. Make sure to visit our website, soundtrackyourlife.net, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too.